They are claims that have haunted some in Israel for decades. The early establishment accused of kidnapping children born to Jewish Arab immigrants to the state, then adopting them out to Jews of European descent or sending them abroad. Several government investigations over the years have come to a different conclusion, that those children actually died at birth. Now, a new twist, and CCTV's Rory Ruttenberg is joining us now with insight.
Well, Mike, 3 previous investigations have included testimony from more than 1,000 people and more than 1 million pages of documents, all of it sealed until the year 2071, largely because of a privacy law. But that has long fueled suspicion, speculation, and claims that authorities may be hiding something. Now lawmakers from both sides of Israel's political spectrum say it might be time to declassify the material. And for the first time, the country's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is publicly supporting that effort.
Shoshana Dugma came to Israel in 1950 as a refugee from Yemen. In the newborn country, she had a newborn baby girl.
I breastfed her for a month or 2 at the camp's nursery where babies were kept. I breastfed her 3 times a day.
Dugma said her daughter was kept in a separate part of the refugee camp. Everything was fine until...
One morning, I went once again, but she wasn't in her bed. There were only nurses around. I asked them where my daughter was, but no one knew.
Dugma is one of more than 1,000 women who say their babies went missing. They say hospitals gave away babies born to Jewish immigrants from Arab countries to Western families. The last major commission to look into the matter in 2001 rejected those claims, saying most of the babies died. Documents used in the investigation were ordered sealed. Several Israeli lawmakers now want them opened and are calling for a new investigation.
This subject is always on the daily agendas of families. It is children that were abducted, not objects. Today, what has changed is that it is legitimate for people to come forward and tell their story. Many people didn't appear before earlier investigation committees because they were afraid to tell their personal stories.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agrees, saying, quote, "The time has come to find out what happened and to do justice." Gil Grunbaum says he knows the truth. He grew up as the son of European Holocaust survivors and says he was stunned to discover he was actually adopted. He says his biological mother, a Jewish immigrant from Tunisia, was told her son had died at birth.
I couldn't understand how they didn't want to see their dead child, and there was no funeral, but they were naive, new immigrants. They didn't ask too many questions. They accepted things at face value, and that was the end of it.
A number of scholars have also looked into claims. Most say it's unlikely this was a systematic problem or an official policy, nor that there was any widespread cover-up. But they recognize that it might be important for the public to fully understand what actually happened in those early years of the states, and the files, Mike, may go a long way to doing that.
So it started all, 1948 is the time when Israel was founded. And these disappearances alleged to have happened pretty early on. So describe the political landscape back then.
That's right. The country in the last 70 years going from a population of 800,000 to 8 million people. By many accounts, a successful melting pot. But we're talking about these early years, a new country under threat of war and attack, struggling to absorb these people to create a national identity. Thousands of immigrants coming in, many of them what's called Ashkenazi Jews from Europe. The rest, many of them from Mizrahi Jews from Northern Africa and the Middle East. Many of them, of course, Jews persecuted back in their own country, afraid to speak up, to ask questions, to make demands. All of this is happening in these migrant camps. Early Israel is relatively poor. It's struggling to organize. Some of the Yemenite women having children at very early ages, ages 12 and 13, a relatively high mortality rate by some estimates, 50 to 80%. Now, legal experts say that what likely happened is that indeed many of these children did die, but because the families were not notified quickly enough and because Jewish law dictates a burial within 24 hours, the burials were often done without the family's knowledge or consent. Insensitive perhaps, but they say that it's unlikely to suggest that there was a policy of disappearing children and giving them to either families, either in Israel or abroad. None of that, unfortunately, was helped with the fact that 18 years later, some of these families received military draft notices for these sons that were missing from birth.
You know what's interesting about this, whether it's true or not, it kind of illustrates a certain amount of discrimination, racism, if you will, between Jewish groups. Some people might even say that this is even going on even today. Would you agree?
Well, that's right, and I think, racial and cultural tension and elitism definitely defined the early years of Israel, and some of that has lingered on for decades, but I think some of that reflected greater elitism in the world, if you will. Of course, Western Europe, considered to be developed, enlightened, some of these ideas that we've often heard. The East wasn't. You had immigrants and refugees, particularly from Europe, bringing those worldviews to Israel when they come. Now, it didn't help that Israel was at war with many Arab countries, so Mizrahi Jews, many of whom spoke Arabic at home, were discouraged from speaking Arabic in school and in the public space, and as a result, I think Mizrahi culture turned into a subset culture within Israeli society. And of course, politically racist comments didn't help. You had the liberal Prime Minister early on, Golda Meir, saying that a good Jew speaks Yiddish, the language spoken by many European Jews. And by the way, that politically solidified many Mizrahi Jews to the right, still to this day. But I think with social media, we've seen a general awareness, Mizrahi culture finding a collective voice, and now you're seeing a prominence of many Mizrahi elements of Mizrahi culture, music, food, art. You have leading Mizrahi artists like the Awa sisters, a Yemenite group singing in their Yemenite dialect, emerging in the top of the charts, not just in Israel, but interestingly in the Arab world as well. You have Arab authors who are writing about Mizrahi culture and Mizrahi disposition, and they're being awarded national prizes. You have the culture minister now, Miri Regev, advancing Mizrahi culture within Israel. It's a bit like what we're seeing in the U.S., the Black Lives Matter movement, but I think it's important to stress that the Israeli race issue cannot be viewed with the same lens as the U.S. one. Of course, you don't have issues like slavery and segregation, and twice Israel has sent in secret operations planes to bring Ethiopian Jews to Israel and has fully integrated them. We've seen mixed Ashkenazi Mizrahi couples in Israel for years. No one bats an eye. And I think what's happening now is this demand that Mizrahi culture be put on par with Western culture, with Ashkenazi culture, and it's no longer acceptable to mock it, to ridicule it, to satire, and I think that's what we're seeing this context happening in.
Let's end this conversation where we began, this renewed investigation. What's likely to happen?
Well, I think unless this commission can be convinced that there's new evidence, a new investigation most likely won't happen. It should be pointed out that for more than a decade there has been this annual remembrance of Yemenite children. That already exists. Also, their individual families have had access to their own files as well. Again, privacy here being an issue. To have it be publicly opened, in general, the documents released to the public, you need widespread Knesset approval. That may happen. Advocates note that this is not about a witch hunt, that they're not trying to get reparations, that they don't necessarily want to see head rolls here, they just want to know the truth. But some say that this could open wounds and warn that some could politicize these old wounds, of course, for political advantage.